Penguin Random House Audio presents The Terror Years, From al-Qaeda to the Islamic State, by Lawrence Wright. Read for you by John H. Mayer, with a prologue read by the author.
Prologue. My experience in the Middle East began as a kind of accident of history. I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and I had to spend 2 years doing alternative service in a low-paying job, at least 50 miles from home, that was nominally in the national interest. Such jobs typically consisted of changing bedpans in hospitals, but this was during the Nixon recession, and even those jobs were hard to come by. I didn't mind being away from home. At the time, I wanted to get as far away from America as possible. I went to the United Nations in New York, thinking that there would be a position that might satisfy these requirements. The person who met me had apparently encountered others in my situation. He said that while working at the UN did not qualify as alternative service, he had a list of American institutions abroad that should serve. One of them had an office across the street. It was the American University in Cairo. I didn't know, when I walked across United Nations Plaza, that the United States and Egypt had no diplomatic relations, and that there were scarcely any Americans in the whole country outside of the diminished faculty at AUC. I'm not sure I even knew what language they spoke in Egypt. But 30 minutes after I entered the office, I was asked if I could leave that very night. No, I couldn't. My clothes were in Boston along with my girlfriend. I hadn't told my parents what I was doing. I also had to consult with my draft board. In that case, could I leave tomorrow? 48 hours later, I taught my first class to young Egyptians whose English language ability wasn't quite good enough to gain admission to the university. That stint in Egypt would shape my career in decisive ways. In 1998, I was the co-writer of a movie, The Siege, starring Denzel Washington, Bruce Willis, Annette Bening, and Tony Shalhoub, which was about a hypothetical attack by an Arab terrorist on New York City. The question the movie posed was, what would happen if terrorism came to America in the same way that it was already being experienced in France and England? How would we react? What kind of country would we become? The Siege was a box office failure, in part because of protests by Arabs and Muslims resentful of being stereotyped as terrorists. After 9/11, it was the most rented movie in America. It came to be seen as a kind of creepy prophecy. For the next 5 years, I was immersed in researching the Looming Tower, al-Qaeda, and the road to 9/11. There are 3 pieces included here as consolidated portraits that would later be incorporated in different form into that book. The man behind bin Laden took me back to Egypt in order to learn about Ayman al-Zawahiri, then the number 2 man in al-Qaeda, who had become its leader upon the death of bin Laden. It was strange to find the country I had been so fond of now roiled by the conflicting emotions of pride, shame, and denial that the attacks on New York and Washington had engendered. It was also disconcerting to revisit places once dear to me, now stained with such starkly different connotations. The classrooms of the American University where I had taught were haunted by the ghost of Muhammad Atta, who had studied English there. And the Mahdi Sporting Club, where I had played in tennis tournaments, had also hosted young Ayman al-Zawahiri at the outdoor cinema on summer evenings. The counter-terrorist began days after 9/11 as I was desperately trying to find a way to understand how and why this had happened. I began going through obituaries that were then streaming online. On the Washington Post site, I found one for John O'Neill, the former head of counterterrorism in the New York office of the FBI, the same office I had written about in The Siege. The obit made it seem as if O'Neill was a bit of a disgrace. He had lost his job shortly before 9/11 because he had taken classified information out of the office. He then became head of security at the World Trade Center and died on that day. At the time, I thought his death was ironic. Instead of getting bin Laden got him. I now think of O'Neill's death as a Greek tragedy. He willingly placed himself at what he expected would be ground zero in the tragedy he saw approaching. A related piece, included here, is The Agent, my profile of Ali Soufan, John O'Neill's talented protege, who was the case agent of the USS Cole bombing by al-Qaeda in October 2000. Soufan also played an unwitting role in my research for the siege. I had heard about a skillful undercover operative in the New York office of the Bureau, a Muslim American who was born in Beirut and spoke fluent Arabic. I based the Tony Shalhoub character on him, although Soufan and I wouldn't actually meet until several years later. In this piece, I raise questions about the failure of the CIA to cooperate with Soufan's investigation into the murder of 17 American sailors. Had the agency responded to Soufan's requests for information, leads that would have exposed the presence of al-Qaeda in America 20 months before 9/11, it's very likely that those attacks would never have happened. To this day, the CIA has failed to hold anyone accountable for this catastrophic negligence. I knew that Osama bin Laden was going to be one of my central characters in the Looming Tower, but for more than a year the Saudis refused to give me a visa as a journalist. Finally, I got a job as the mentor to young reporters at the Saudi Gazette, an English-language daily in Jeddah, bin Laden's hometown. Normally, when I am researching a piece, I'm in a hotel making calls, trying to set up appointments. In this case, I lived in a middle-class Saudi flat, and I went to work every day. I was nominally teaching the craft of journalism, but my students were teaching me far more about their country than I could ever have learned on my own. It was a chastening lesson about the blinders the reporters wear when they drop from the sky into another culture. My experience is chronicled here in The Kingdom of Silence. Silence was a theme that drew me to another country, Syria, in 2006. The Middle East is a quarrelsome, voluble region, paradise for reporters, except when it is a lethal trap. But Syria was oddly mute. At a remove, it seemed progressive and secular compared with its Arab neighbors, but also elusive and enigmatic. How could I hope to decipher such a reticent culture? I reflected on how much the world understands America by our movies. Syria had a small but intriguing film industry, and I decided to watch Syrian movies and interview the filmmakers in order to glimpse the nation's closely guarded inner world. The piece is called Captured on Film. What I found was a people who had been beaten into silence. The Civil War was hard to imagine back then, but the desperation and simmering fury were already evident, both in the filmmakers and in their art. Al-Qaeda and its progeny are not only terror organizations, but also religious cults, deviant, isolated, and hostile to opposing views. Since 9/11, al-Qaeda has presented an extraordinary opportunity to observe a belief system that is evolving under pressure and adapting to challenges. I've traced some of the consequential but often bewildering theological arguments that govern this movement in The Master Plan, The Rebellion Within, and The Terror Web. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute has provided moral justification for terrorism, with devastating consequences for the region. In 2006, a young Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, was captured by Hamas, which demanded 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange. Before that deal was finally struck, Israel invaded and 13 Israelis and 1,400 Gazans were killed. The disparity in the value of human lives struck me as being one of the confounding factors that contributes to violence on both sides. I call the piece Captives because it reflects the condition of both Gilad Shalit, and the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?